Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Thanks for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. I'm Nathan Kiker, along with my co-host, George Bogdan. Our guest today is Charles Kupchan. Charles is an American scholar of international relations who serves as a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He previously served on the National Security Council as Director for European Affairs under President Bill Clinton, and later as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European Affairs in the Obama administration. Charles, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you.
In one or two lines, how do you define liberal realism? And what makes it different from classic primacy or restraint?
I consider myself a realist in as much as I think the world is driven by power politics, is driven by countries that feel threatened and they're seeking to maximize their security and their prosperity. But I consider myself a liberal realist in the sense that I think that the geopolitical rivalry that realists generally see as inescapable and pervasive, I think it is escapable. It's difficult to do. It is all too rare. When countries escape geopolitical rivalry, they often enjoy quiescence or peace only for a short period of time. But I do think that we've seen, whether it's the US and Canada, France and Germany, other pockets of space in which the rules of realpolitik don't apply. And that's why I consider myself a liberal realist as opposed to a kind of hard-boiled realist that thinks that there's no way to tame the realist imperatives.
What would some of those arenas be in which kind of the assumptions of realism don't play out?
Well, I think you can just look around the world and see pockets of space that are no longer playing by the rules of realpolitik. One of them would be North America, where it's really been over 100 years, going back to the turn of the century, in which the United States border with Canada has been largely undefended, and in which neither Canada nor the United States has maintained war plans against each other. The European Union is one of the great geopolitical revolutions of our time. You can now drive from France to Germany, and you don't see a tank, you don't pass a border guard, you don't change money. These are borders that have become irrelevant. In some ways, the United States itself is an example of a process of integration and rapprochement that has made internal boundaries effectively geopolitically inconsequential, right? And they didn't used to be. The United States fought a civil war in the 1860s. Now, most people consider themselves American before Virginian. They consider themselves American before Michiganders. The only exception may be Texas, where people consider themselves Texans first and Americans second. So these are all examples of countries, of units, of polities that have been able to defy the realist imperative. But, and this is an important but, we're now living through a moment in which we don't know whether history is going to go into reverse. Right? We don't know whether the European Union is in the process of eroding. Britain has already left. Ethno-nationalism and far-right populism are on the rise. The Prime Minister of Canada is basically saying, we need to form alliances with middle powers. We don't trust the United States anymore. Maybe the U.S.-Canadian border is coming back to life as a geopolitical dividing line. And so it's that fragility, it's the contingent nature of durable peace that in the end makes me more of a realist than a liberal.
Would you say that President Trump is sort of haggling back towards a more realist paradigm for the Western Hemisphere? I'm astonished sometimes by how openly there is a discussion of what some would say is our oldest national security strategy, the Monroe Doctrine, or is that a kind of misconception?
No, I think that Trump is to some extent taking us back to a world of might makes right, and in particular, that version of American statecraft is most pronounced in the Western Hemisphere because the national security doctrine that was published last year came right out and said, we're going back to the Monroe Doctrine. It came right out and said, we are going to reassert hemispheric hegemony through coercive means if possible. And we've seen those coercive means in Venezuela. We've seen Trump threaten coercive means over Greenland, but back down. Now maybe the next target in Trump's sights is Cuba. And so this is a kind of foreign policy that re-emphasizes the coercive use of both economic and military power in a way that I think we haven't seen in the Western Hemisphere for a while. It's not new. I would say it was to some extent in recession. What kind of vision Trump has globally, I think it's hard to say. Some people believe that he wants to return to a world of great power spheres of influence. Some people feel that Trump is more interested in returning to some form of American isolationism, pulling out of Europe, pulling out of Asia, ending NATO, and focusing on the Western Hemisphere. Frankly, I don't think anybody knows exactly what strategic vision Trump has in mind, including Trump himself, because I do think right now we have a president who acts more on impulse and instinct than on some clear set of strategic propositions.
I mean, in many ways, can't you argue that the sort of spheres of influence model for the US would be in line with the multipolar world that you've described? And if so, what does that actually mean for global stability moving forward if we are a multipolar world as opposed to a hegemon?
Well, I think that we're still early in this transition, and that the United States plus its key democratic allies still represent a majority of global wealth. And if you line up the United States with various other democracies and you look at GDP and you look at military output, the Chinese, the Russians, some combination of adversaries do not yet amount to a challenger that is roughly equal or close to equal in weight. But the trend lines in my mind are quite clear. And that is that power is shifting from the west to the east. It's shifting from the north to the south. In the second half of the 21st century, those countries that used to have top 5 economies, like Germany, France, the UK, Japan, they're not going to make it into the top pack anymore. Up there will be China and India and Indonesia and Nigeria and the United States. But we are moving toward a world that will be what I would call decentered. There won't be a hegemon. It won't be an American century or a Chinese century or an Asian century. It will just be a decentered, disaggregated world. And so I do think that naturally, as power diffuses from east to west and north to south, you're going to get more regionalism. You're going to see the devolution of authority and responsibility to regions. Will that, on some level, naturally create great power spheres of influence? Yes. But I think one key difference looking forward is that we still need a significant level of global coordination and cooperation, simply because there are now so many global challenges, whether it is proliferation, pandemics, climate change, global development, that will require cooperation among key players. And so I do think one of the toughest challenges moving forward is how to secure cooperation across geopolitical and ideological dividing lines, how to secure cooperation across regional dividing lines. Because right now we're moving in the wrong direction.
Well, I could be wrong, but I don't think that we've had real coordination and cooperation since the signing of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Iran deal, and the Paris Climate Accords, all which happened around 2015. Isn't that world already dead? And if so, what does it mean?
That world is on life support. I wouldn't say that it's completely dead in the sense that every once in a while you can get the United States and China to work together. When the dust clears and the war in Ukraine comes to an end, you may see the United States and Russia working together on arms control on key issues. I think Trump has that in mind as he tries to negotiate an end to the conflict. But the bottom line, Nathan, is that you're right. We are moving to a world in which the demand for global governance is rising, the supply of global governance is rapidly declining, and as a consequence, we're all going to suffer. And that's why I do think that one of the $6 million questions for all of us is, how are we going to find a way of reversing this decline in multilateralism? How are we going to build connective tissue across dividing lines? Because if we don't do that, I think the globalized and interdependent world that we live in, it will become more and more difficult to govern, and all of us are going to sink together if we don't swim together.
I'm just interested in the multilateral question, whether you think that it's a feature or a bug of multilateral institutions that they tend to have this sort of presumption or pretension of constraining American power. Do you think it's possible to move to a form of multilateralism where, the facilitation of cooperation is there, but this kind of constant sense that it's their role to sort of hold the United States back from its worst intentions, whether that can be reduced or done away with?
Well, I think international institutions are sort of go-to ways of facilitating cooperation, in part because they do bind great powers, right? One of the reasons that smaller European countries joined the European Union was to find a way to regulate French and German power. ASEAN does the same with Indonesia. The Gulf Cooperation Council, in some ways, binds Saudi Arabia, its largest member, to certain rules. I think the countries of East Asia are interested in what's called RCEP, a regional multilateral economic forum, because it binds China to rule. So this is part of what institutions do. And at the same time, those large powers find those institutions useful because they are in some ways extensions of their power and furthers their interest. I do, however, think that when it comes to the deep institutionalized multilateralism of the post-World War II era, that's increasingly hard to come by. And that countries like the United States, like China, in many cases, the Europeans are heading in the same direction, simply don't have the same political appetite for institutionalized multilateralism that they used to. If we ran a thought experiment, right, and we took the post-World War II architecture, the UN, NATO, the Bretton Woods system, the IMF, the World Bank, and the three of us went down to the Senate and said to the Senate, please ratify this, right? They would look at us like we've lost our minds. And that's because the political landscape has so dramatically changed. And so I think moving forward, there's going to be a much heavier reliance on multilateralism light, coalitions of the willing, the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris climate agreement, the small coalitions that are emerging to negotiate over the war in Iran, over Gaza, over Syria, right? These are countries coming together in an ad hoc and in a flexible way to try to resolve problems. I think that, in many respects, is the pattern that we're going to increasingly see.
Looking forward, what would be some of the global alliances that drive the 21st century in the way that we know what they were in the 20th century, but what will emerge in your mind that will have the most impact on the world order in this century?
I think that we are, in some ways, in what the Indians call a multi-alignment world. And that means that there won't be fixed alliances of the sort that we saw in the 20th century with NATO over here and the Warsaw Pact over there, and most countries around the world choosing sides. I think we're headed into a period of history where there's much more fluidity and much more unpredictability. I think the relationship between China and Russia is much more a marriage of convenience than a durable alliance of the sort that we've seen between the United States and its democratic partners. And so one question that I think is probably the most important on the alliance front is, will the community of democracies hang together? Will 5 years from now NATO exist? Will, as this world moves toward a decentered world with no ideological center of gravity or anchor, will the West still be the West? Will it remain a grouping of countries that hangs together and tries to push a multipolar world in a peaceful direction? I hope the answer to that is yes, but on a daily basis now, we hear President Trump talking about withdrawing from NATO. We hear NATO heads of state express deep frustration with the United States. If you are an American ally, you have no question to say, can we still count on the United States? And that's simply because, given the state of our politics, given polarization and ideological division, we are now an unpredictable country. And so for me, I think the key question is, are we going to make it through this period with America's key alliances intact, or are they going to be casualties of this period of geopolitical change?
Do we even need NATO anymore? Of course, President Trump's been talking about NATO, but just in the last year, we've rewritten trade rules around the world. We've taken the president of Venezuela. We might take Cuba. We've knocked out the leadership in Iran. NATO kind of seems like a backbench player. Why do they matter when we still are the strongest in the world right now?
Well, I think that, and maybe this is the liberal in me speaking out rather than the realist.
Yeah. Same, Charles, same.
Yeah. I'd rather see the world tilt in a progressive direction, right? I'd rather wake up in 2050 and see the world more free than less free, more prosperous than less prosperous. And I do think that, on balance, the liberal democracies have done better job of pushing history in the right direction than the autocracies. And so, everything else being equal, I'm hopeful that the democracies will continue to band together and to support a world that heads in the direction of more freedom. Because I think all of us will be better off if that's the case. But I do think that we will get there only if democracies do a better job of demonstrating that they can deliver. Democracy has a natural leg up over the alternatives, and that is that it responds to what I think is a universal desire for dignity, a universal desire for human autonomy. But delivering dignity and autonomy in theory isn't enough, right? They got to deliver the goods. And I think one of the backstories to this conversation that we're having today is that we are in the process of a fundamental transition from the industrial age to the digital age. The automation that is coming with digital technology is undermining the social contract of the industrial era, which is why so many Americans and Germans and Brits and Japanese are feeling unhappy and economically insecure. And that, for me, is the core problem that is afflicting liberal democracies. And so I think if we're going to keep NATO alive, if we're going to create a world in which liberal democracies are still an anchor of the system, we've got to figure out how to deliver to our citizens. We've got to figure out the future of work in the digital age. Because the one thing that I can say with confidence about the Trump era, tariffs won't work. Americans are not going to get their well-paid jobs back building air conditioners and refrigerators. And so we have to have an honest conversation inside this country about what Americans are going to do in 2035 to earn a living wage. And the answer is not that they are going back to the manufacturing line. And that, in some ways, to me, is at the heart of a national conversation that we need to have, but that we're not having.
I want to shift a little bit from theory to a few specific hotspots around the world. You've argued that it might be time for Ukraine to shift from offensive to defensive. What does a realistic, if imperfect, endgame look like for that conflict?
Well, I think that Trump is right to try to end the conflict at the negotiating table. I think Trump is right to talk to Putin. I wish that Trump had around him a set of advisors with more expertise and more knowledge of Russia. But I think that this is a war that Ukraine is not going to win. And as a consequence, the sooner it comes to an end, the better. The deal that is on the table is, in my mind, the right deal. That is to say that Zelensky, the Ukrainians, decide to sacrifice those parts of Ukraine already occupied by Russia, and perhaps some or all of Donbass that Putin is requesting, in return for an end to the war, in return for security guarantees, in return for Putin's willingness to let the rest of Ukraine go. What we don't know, and I think what we have to figure out, is whether Putin is prepared to stop. Is he really ready to call it quits if he is able to create some sort of deal and get some territorial concessions from Zelensky? If the answer to that is yes, I would encourage Zelensky to take the deal. If the answer to that is no, and Putin still thinks that he can turn the rest of Ukraine into a vassal state, then I don't think the Ukrainians have much choice but to keep fighting.
Okay. Can Europe build a stable security order that eventually includes Russia in some fashion, or are we stuck with a long, cold peace after this?
I think in the short term, we're stuck with a redivided Europe. I don't think that Europeans are going to ever trust Putin after what he has done in Ukraine. And it's important to keep in mind that although we read mainly about Ukraine, there are constant incursions of European airspace by Russian drones, Russian aircraft, cyber attacks, meddling of this sort or that. And so I do think that, at least for now, we're looking at a very troubled relationship between Europe and Russia. I don't think that's permanent. I think in many respects, Russia sees itself as a European power. And so I do think that in a post-Putin era, you will see an effort to rebuild political, economic, and social connections between Europe and Russia. But Putin, he may be around for quite a long time. And as a consequence, I think for now we're stuck with a relationship that is going to be pretty distrustful and conflictual.
Yeah. Thank you, Charles. And for our listeners, where can they continue to follow your scholarship and your work?
CFR.org, I guess, is one place where they put things up. I'm a little bit skittish about social media, but I do tweet occasionally at Charles Kupchan. Maybe I'll do the social media thing more a little bit later, but so far I'm taking it gingerly.
That's a healthy way to do it. But Charles, thanks again for joining Clearer Than Truth. Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time.